I'm Joseph Rescigno, talking about my book, Conducting Opera, Where Theater Meets Music. In the last video, we talked about through composition. And implicit in that is applause, because through composition is continual music without breaks to accommodate applause. I also mentioned in certain places in an opera that the composer probably conceived of as through composed, but small cuts are made to accommodate applause. And in the opera Tosca, and I give the exact citations in my book. However, I'd like to talk about just the opposite today. I'd like to talk about applause that the composer expected, but that today would probably be tepid at best or non-existent at worst. I'd also like to talk about cathartic applause, where an audience applauds the dramatic situation as opposed to the musical and singer's abilities. And finally, how to accommodate the very real possibility of silence, that because the audience maybe is less predictable today than it would be 50 years ago. All right, so the first. In Traviata, both in the connection of the aria A Forse Lui and the cabaletta Sempre Libera, there is no intervening chorus or other scene between an aria and a cabaletta the way there would be, for example, in Lucia, in the Mad Scene. It just goes on. But Verdi obviously expected some applause after the first aria because he wrote a fermata over the rest between the end of one and the beginning of the other. The same thing is true about 2/3 of the way through the duet of Violetta and Germont in Act 2. There is a fermata right over the rest at the end of a chord ending a little section, but long before the end of the duet. In both cases, the applause at any time will be greater the longer the audience waits to applause. The biggest applause is usually at the end of something like Rheingold, where for 2.5 hours they're listening to this great dramatic music without a chance to applaud and then just explode at the end. Now, a conductor can effectively go through these two sections. How? By putting the fermata not on the rest, but on the last chord, and asking the singer to sing the first line afterwards right with or right immediately after the cutoff. So instead of having this, Folie, there'll be either some tepid applause or worse yet, 3.5 seconds of embarrassing silence. However, if I put the fermata on the rest and she begins, I'd rather put the fermata on the note, on the chord, and she begins right as I cut that off, we go right on, and there's no danger of that. So. Folie, folie. And we keep the propulsion, the dramatic propulsion of the scene moving forward. Same thing in the duet with Germont. instead of imponete, there's this embarrassing silence, which might get a little applause, but it will rob the greater applause that would come if the scene just moved forward. So I do this. Imponete, non amarlo, ditegli. Okay. In the case of the duet, the great duet between Adalgisa and Norma in the second act of the opera Norma, you don't have to put a fermata on the chord. All you have to do is eliminate the fermata on the following rest, and basically the tempo, what was a quarter note, becomes the speed of the new half note, which gives you maximum a second, but less than a second of silence. And the scene just moves forward. So you have Cedi de cedi, lasciami, instead of waiting for some tepid applause before her line cedi. Now, the second kind of applause I spoke about was cathartic applause. That is, the audience is applauding the dramatic situation, not necessarily the musical situation, the bravura, the singer. Two operas where they inevitably happen, where this inevitably happens, is in Act 2 of La Bohème and in Act 2 of Madame Butterfly. In Bohème, it happens after Musetta's waltz, at the climax of the big ensemble, and just before the offstage banda begins for the parade that will end the act. In it, Marcello is reunited with Musetta. He picks her up at the climax, picks her up in his arms, and the lovers are together again. And we hear this. Here's where the applause happens. Okay. Now, there is potentially a great danger should the applause go too long. And that's this. The banda has to hear the orchestra and what's happening to be in sync with it. And the conductor has to hear the banda. And if that is not going to happen, the scene is going to come to grief. However, if the conductor realizes that when he writes allargando and then meno mosso, slower, you really take that slower and you take it at a very leisurely tempo. Number one, it'll be in the right speed for the banda, because one measure of the banda should equal one beat of what you're doing in the previous music. Plus, it will give plenty of time for the audience's reaction to the story to dissipate. So, make sure it's this. even at that speed, in over 20 years, I've never had applause go into the danger zone. The other place where they didn't used to applaud so much, but they do now, is after Butterfly looks through the spyglass, sees that Pinkerton's ship is back, and she tells Suzuki, my love has triumphed. He's come back and he loves me. E torna e mama. And the orchestra is very dramatic, and nowadays, in the majority of cases, there will be some cathartic applause from the audience. Here again, if you give it plenty of time, take a very slow tempo, it'll dissipate. Another bit of advice, just before the singer comes in, believe me, the louder you can and more intensely have the orchestra play, because no one's singing, the more exciting it is. But then cut everything off so that when she starts, and very quietly with the orchestra underneath her, the echo and the resonance of the previous music doesn't cover her. So it should sound like this. Cut off. And here again, you're safe. There is one point where the composer wrote it as through composed, but especially if it's well performed, the audience could burst into applause and could cover the singing right afterwards. And that is after the aria Nessun Dorma in the opera Turandot. Years ago, when I was young, began seeing opera for the first time, the audience knew not to cover. They saw that everything was going on and people started to sing. But especially in the last 20 years, this opera, this aria is almost become the most famous in all of opera. And if well sung, it's possible that the applause could interfere with the singing of Ping Pang Pong. Number one, you can't take an exaggeratedly slow tempo because the music doesn't permit it, which sounds ridiculous. Secondly, he doesn't give very much time. So what I suggest, it's the only time I really did have to stop the show and let the audience have their moment of applauding a wonderful tenor. I told the orchestra and the cast and made sure that everybody, including the stagehands and everybody, knew that should this be the case, I will restart at number 6 and once the audience has applauded. But it's this part. Vincerò, vincerò. And in the last 5 measures I just played, they're singing. Ping, Pang, and Pong are singing. So they will get, because the orchestra is fairly loud, he'll be able to hear to come in. But once they start singing and doing their acting and they're moving around, if the audience has not stopped, the safest and best thing for everybody is just to stop and start over again. Now, the last thing I'd like to talk about is the danger of real silence. In two places. In one case, when Puccini wrote Manon Lescaut, in the last act there is a wonderful aria for the soprano that I'm not so sure that even Puccini expected applause. It's the aria Sola perduta abbandonata. Why do I say I'm not sure if he expected applause? Well, it ends dramatically, but there's a little tag of about 2.5 measures that closes out the aria, and then everyone drops out at the end of the last chord, except the double basses that hold this low note. And she comes in after one beat against the double basses. Now, the way it was all often done when I began was everything was cut off, there'd be applause, and then they'd start again with the double basses and her line together, the conductor. The danger is that if you do that and there's silence, it's hard to start again. And believe me, 3 or 4 seconds of silence is an eternity in the theater. So my suggestion as a safety valve is I don't cut off the double basses, and I let a second, maximum a second and a half go by, and if there's no applause, I point to her and she continues. The other case is the prelude to Act 1 of Traviata. Now, the way Verdi writes it, he puts a fermata over the final rest, which is the 3rd and 4th beat of that measure, would accommodate applause. And then you begin Act 1. But if there is tepid applause, or worse yet, no applause at all, it's very embarrassing, and the opera's gotten off to a terrible start. So to use that word again, propulsion, the safest thing is to put the fermata over the last chord in the orchestra, not over the rest, over the last chord. And then I tell the orchestra, the tempo that I beat 3 and 4, those quarters, is the same speed as I expect the half note in the opening of Act 1, which is in 2. So they get effectively 1 measure of the new tempo before they have to start. So you'll hear this. Three, 4, 1. And we're off to the races. Thank you very much. Until next time. And don't forget to, number 1, subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, to share it with those you think would find it interesting. And please, if you have comments, give them to me, or if you have questions, I will try to answer them.